Welcome on behalf of the Center for Process Studies. My name is Andrew Davis, and I lead research and academics here at the Center for Process Studies. To those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we are a research and nonprofit educational organization, and we're founded principally on the thought of Alfred North Whitehead and process relational philosophy. And we exist to explore the reach and relevance of process modes of thought to all manner of disciplines. And we do so through the organization of conferences, book series, courses, and a variety of other endeavors. And we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this conversation today with the Institute for Cultural Evolution, whose express mission is to advance the evolution of consciousness and culture in America in an effort to overcome hyper-partisan polarization, which, as you've noticed, perhaps is only increased and in many ways threatens the ideals of democratic sensibility. So we're pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with them, and would encourage everyone, if you're interested in learning more about the Center for Process Studies and the Institute for Cultural Evolution, to check out our website. Our emphasis, our focus today will be on the intersection of philosophy and cultural evolution, and in particular, its relation to the work of Iain McGilchrist and what he's called the Hemisphere Hypothesis. And I'm happy to say that we've included alongside Iain as a great thought leader, yet another great thought leader by the name of Steve McIntosh. And I want to offer an orienting introduction to Steve. So Steve McIntosh is a developmental philosopher who focuses principally on the evolution of consciousness and culture. He's the co-founder of our co-sponsor, that is the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and has himself authored a number of popular books, including recently Developmental Politics in 2020, The Presence of the Infinite in 2015, Evolution's Purpose in 2012, and Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution in 2007. He also co-authored Conscious Leadership with John Mackey and Carter Phipps, and is currently, as I mentioned, working on finishing up his next book, which will be on developmental philosophy and should be hitting the shelves in the coming months, I suspect. His writing has appeared widely, for example, in USA Today, Real Clear Politics, The Daily Beast, The Hill, Arrow Magazine, and The Developmentalist. And like Iain, he has spent much time on different podcast forums, from NPR to The Glenn Show to Rebel Wisdom and a variety of other podcasts. He was not always a writer of this caliber. He had a number of other successful careers, the founding, for example, of a consumer products company, now in Zen, and practicing law with one of America's largest firms. He graduated originally from University of Virginia Law School and the University of Southern California Business School, and grew up in Los Angeles. And he's currently a resident of Boulder, Colorado, with his family. So Steve, it's great to have you, and we've known each other for some years now and have connected on our work. But just happy to invite you to this forum and want you to have any introductory words yourself as we get going.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you and all the good folks who showed up here live. I think what I hope to get out of this discussion most directly is to consider and examine how philosophy itself is beginning to experience a kind of revival, right? And what this revival, I think, can really do in the world is cause further cultural evolution, right? The next step of our development or our cultural maturity. How can we grow out of the somewhat messy circumstances we're in at the moment? I have great confidence that we will, and I think philosophy is going to play an important role. And getting down to the details and the specifics of actually how that might happen, right? It's not just wishful thinking. We have some, I think, powerful ideas about how philosophy can come to the fore again as a lever for social progress. And so that's where my work is focused at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we can pick up on that whole question of the role of philosophy a bit, because it's interesting to see that the sort of foster mother of modern science was natural philosophy, right? We think of Aristotle and his extraordinary methods of classification, and himself a absolutely brilliant philosophical mind. and the emergence of modern science sort of out of natural philosophy. And yet it's interesting to see nowadays, as I was mentioning before we got on, these different thought leaders, Hawking, philosophy is dead, or DeGrasse Tyson saying, well, philosophy doesn't really tell us anything about the natural world, or even Yuval Noah Harari, right, as I mentioned, who thinks that, well, all the old ideas of philosophy, of the soul, free will, value, science has really shown these things to be just rather illusory. And it seems like there's an underlining philosophy that's unconscious there, right? Which is, it's almost shocking that it's not acknowledged. And it raises this larger question of the public perception of philosophy given a modern scientific worldview, and what role that is. And I see your work, I see Iain's work in many ways as a part of reawakening a certain role that has been a part of the Western philosophical tradition. So any comment on that?
Well, sure. I think there's no escaping philosophy. We can no more escape philosophy than we can escape the concept of the real, right? In other words, we're framing reality either tacitly or directly in one way or another. And I think that we need to give what I think is best described as physicalism, right? Scientific materialism. There's many different words for the framing of reality as basically physical, right? With maybe a little supervenience of consciousness over the top, right? There's lots of debate going on right now about how physical is consciousness. But
Yeah.
the ontology of physicalism still dominates, right? Not only in the scientific community, but also in much of the philosophical community. And I think the task of growing beyond that, the task of recognizing that what started out as an empirical method grew to the point where it became a reality frame, and in its attempt to sort of transcend religious reality frames, it created its own kind of religious reality frame, and that is what I would call magical thinking, that the universe is perfectly physical, or that it's just an accident, or that there's no bigger meaning behind it. And just like Iain McGilchrist has used neuroscience, bringing in that element of science to demonstrate, that how physicalism is something that we want to transcend and include. We want to transcend the empirical scientific method and all of the important insights that it's given humanity, but we also need a bigger reality frame that can accommodate what's also empirically real, and that is subjectivity and even intersubjectivity, right? Like you mentioned Harari. He mentions these three categories, the objective, the subjective, and the intersubjective. But then he says that the subject and the intersubjective are just imaginary, right? But he has to say
Right.
that to stay within a physicalist worldview. And I think that frame is now fairly broken, even though plenty of thought leaders on the contemporary scene have not yet gotten that message.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, it's just curious to see these texts. And I'm sure Harari is a lovely individual. I don't know him per se, but after reading a good portion of his text and seeing the popularity, some 50,000 copies sold, and all he can say to the question of, well, what is humanity for? He says, as far as we can tell, nothing. Right? As if our own existence and experience, the confluence of subjectivity and value, is not revelatory about, in some sense, what evolution is up to, what it's doing. And so I think that connects to a larger question I'd like to ask you about. It's one that runs through various texts of yours and perhaps into the new text that you're writing, is the role of evolution as revelation, or the role of evolution as expressing something that we need to attend to closely, and how that changes our understanding of cultural evolution, the evolution of our consciousness. So maybe you can say that and mention perhaps the context of the new sphere as this emerging you know, uh, layer of thought in some sense, indebted to Teilhard, of course, but extending far beyond him as well. Give us the context of some of your new work, and what's the heart of this?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that excellent question. Just like Iain brings in neuroscience, that science, I'm trying to do the same with the science of evolution, because as we
Yeah,
now look at what evolution has revealed, it reveals a universe of purpose and progress. So
yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
that's enough. It's great to see you, Dr. McGilchrist.
We're so glad you've joined us, and we've just been we've been whetting the appetite of the audience here with a few of the themes I think we'll be getting into later. Happy to have you and Steve meet, I believe for the first time, isn't it, here?
Yes, I think it is. Yes, yes.
Excellent. Well, certainly the resonances in your work and in your influence demanded that you meet. So I'm glad we're able to make that happen.
Oh, very good. Well, I'm
So,
looking forward to hearing what Steve has to say. It'll be interesting what the overlaps will turn out to be.
most definitely. Well, just for the sake of those who may not be as familiar with Dr. McGilchrist, I suspect there's very few, but I do want to offer you an introduction, and then I'll just mention the agenda today, and then we'll hand it to you, Iain, to begin for us. So
Okay.
Dr. McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, neuroscience researcher, philosopher, and literary scholar. He is the Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at Bethlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. He's been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. He's published, of course, a variety of articles throughout his career, spanning wide-ranging disciplines from literature to philosophy, medicine, and psychiatry, and is the author, of course, of a number of influential books, perhaps best known for The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World with Yale in 2009. But close behind and growing, I'd suspect, Iain, is the 2-volume masterpiece, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World with Perspectiva in 2021. Many of you are probably familiar with Iain through his many lectures and podcasts. He's all over the virtual space, certainly discussing the relevance of his work. And he lives along the mythically beautiful, I'd say, Isle of Skye there in the northwestern coast of Scotland, where he's chiming in today. So let me just say, in lieu of that introduction, what we aim to do today is 3 movements, essentially. We want to think through the intersection of philosophy, cultural evolution, and the Hemisphere Hypothesis. And so in terms of these movements, we'll first allow Iain to give us an orienting lecture, some 30 to 40 minutes perhaps, on how he understands these connections. We'll then invite Steve to join us to respond to Iain, to engage in dialogue with Iain for 30 minutes or so, after which we'll then toss it to the audience to ask any relevant questions to either Iain or Steve. And I'll do my best as in my moderating position to collect those from the chat. Let me just say to everyone, there's the Q&A function that should be available in the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'd ask that you utilize that with any questions you have for our guests. And of course, with nearly 230 of us, we won't get to all questions, but we'll do our best to get to the most pressing. So with that, Iain, I'll hand the virtual floor to you. And again, thanks to both of you for being here. We look forward to this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And I want to express my pleasure at being with you. I feel very much part of the work that CIIS does, and that you and Matt in particular, I know, follow. So thank you very much. I'm honoured and delighted to be here. So let me start talking about something relevant. Why are the hemispheres relevant? Why would anyone really care what goes on in different halves of the brain? What does it matter where in the brain a so-called function lies? If the brain were really a machine, it would not. But the brain is not a machine. It's part of a person. And it contributes to that personhood in quite distinct, reliably distinct, and indeed superficially incompatible ways through the 2 hemispheres. Now, what if the assorting of characteristics between the hemispheres were not just random, but coherent in a way hitherto unsuspected, giving rise to 2 experiential worlds with predictably different qualities. Would it not be important for philosophy to know about this? I think of Whitehead saying the antagonism between metaphysics and science has been, like all family quarrels, a disaster for both parties. And I strongly believe that. I believe that science can learn from philosophy, very, very much so, and philosophy from science. Further, what if the hemispheres were not of equal value in acquainting us with the world? And one was a much more faithful reporter on and mediator of the world beyond ourselves than its partner. Now, I hold that all these things are true, and I haven't got time to give an enormous backup to them, but a lot of you will know my work, I hope, and I might encourage some of you who don't to read more. But it seems to me that this issue cannot be sidestepped in addressing the probably most important question in philosophy. What is truth? Or at any rate, what can we legitimately take to be closer to truth than its opposite? Intriguingly, philosophers have for a long time intuited the nature of this problem. And in retrospect, we can see it very clearly. Probably the most relevant example is not the earliest, but is Bergson in his Time and Free Will, his doctoral thesis of 1889, Les données immédiates de conscience. He said that there are two quite different orders of reality. But before him, Pascal had said, in one of his Pensées, the twofold nature of man is so evident that some have thought that we had twin souls. And then coming forward a bit, you hear in Goethe's Faust declare, 2 souls, alas, dwell within my breast. Schopenhauer, a little bit later, there are 2 completely distinct forms of experience. That's, of course, from the world as will and representation. And Max Scheler, a philosopher of the early 20th century that I particularly admire, called us a citizen of 2 worlds. That's from his essay, Forms of Knowledge and Culture. And indeed, similar reflections have been made by other philosophers, including Kant. Now, the reason I adverted to Bergson as probably the most important is that in his philosophy, without any knowledge of what we have been able to glean through science since his time, he distinguished what he called intellect from intuition. Now, the terms are not transparent in that what he calls intellect is not the only one that has intelligence. What he called intuition has intelligence too, and intellect, like intuition, has its unexamined assumptions. But what he meant, as is very, very clear from, and he was a wonderfully clear writer, and also, by the way, a very scientific writer. It is a myth that he was in any way anti-scientific. I can hardly think of any philosopher of any period who was more interested in and more problematically involved with science, with physics, of course, but also with biology. And he, in fact, at one point was going to train as a doctor. But what he was seeing there, we now can see, was the difference between the left hemisphere's take and the right hemisphere's take. And the way in which he describes them leaves no doubt that that is what he was intuiting. Now, what can we say about them from advances in neurology since that time? They're not just complementary elements in the brain, as was once assumed. I mean, it would be the natural assumption that the two just simply complemented one another, and quite why there was a whopping great divide down the middle, nobody knows. Why the two hemispheres are fairly dramatically asymmetrical, nobody knows. Why the band of fibers that join the two hemispheres at the base, the corpus callosum, is largely involved in inhibiting, well, that was not known. But we now do know these things. and they are relatively independent. There is mutual inhibition, and that's, as they say, not a bug, but a feature. It's a very important aspect of how our brains function. So that's one thing. Another would be that there are really hitherto unrecognized patterns. They're different from the usual old contrast, reason versus emotion, Kahneman systems 1 versus 2, male and female, all those things. There are differences, of course, but they are slightly beside the mark from the point of view of what hemisphere differences tell us. And this in itself advances our thinking about the two worlds of which we've heard philosophers consistently speaking. So off the cuff, would you imagine not just reason versus emotion or all the other things, but that in one part of the brain there was a facility for appreciating uniqueness that the other half didn't have, but that also went with understanding music and time, a sense of humor, a capacity for reading body language, sustaining attention, and the fight or flight mode. Or, on the other hand, in the left hemisphere, unreasonable optimism, manipulation, disembodiment, literalism, and preoccupations with detail, theory, and parts. They don't sound immediately like more than a strange assortment of features, characteristics, virtues, or vices. But indeed, they are entirely coherent, and in my works, particularly the Master and His Emissary initially, I try to explain how they cohere and why they go together and why that matters. A third thing we know from the advances of neuroscience, which we couldn't have known earlier, is their different degrees of reliability. In one sense, a simple way of explaining the difference between the left hemisphere vision of the world and the right hemisphere's vision is that the left hemisphere's is like a map in relation to the terrain in the right hemisphere. I use the word terrain rather than territory, as Korzybski did, because territory sounds already very much like the occupation of the left hemisphere, whereas terrain is the place where we live. We don't live in a territory. But much further than that important distinction is that the left hemisphere is frankly deluded when it is not under the proper supervision of the right hemisphere. And I really do mean deluded, not in some casual parlance, but I speak it as a neuropsychiatrist. It is essentially deluded. And I'm not the only one to have said so. Many of my neurological colleagues, at least I'm sure I did quote at least a couple in the book that say exactly the same thing. On top of that, it's not that thing that pop psychology always said, that nice, down-to-earth, unemotional, reliable, slightly boring, but extremely helpful in orientating us to reality element of our being. No, it jumps to conclusions. It gets extremely upset if it's contradicted. It majors on anger, it's not unemotional at all. And this tendency to jump to conclusions means that it often makes crass errors. And on top of all this, it has a quality I call stickiness. There are about 4 elements that go to that, but I won't go into that. All one needs to know at the moment is that it has this quality of sticking to whatever it is that it thinks it knows. What it just saw, it will not change. And when you point out to somebody who's relying purely on their left hemisphere that this can't be right, instead of going, maybe we should rethink a bit, it just doubles down on what it mistakenly believes. Those of you who have ever had to deal with a management bureaucracy will know exactly what I mean by that particular phenomenon. And what good, you might say, is what good would knowing all that be unless we could identify which hemisphere is the dominant contributor to a certain way of thinking and being? And I believe this is something that my work has added, that we can see a recognizable imprint on cognition. It has many features and it has a reliably replicable set of features and characteristics, so that we know that this is a typical left hemisphere construct or more a typically right hemisphere construct. And finally, it's unreliable because it is self-reinforcing. You've probably heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which in short says that people who don't know much think they know everything, and people who know a lot realize how very little they know. Well, the left hemisphere literally is less intelligent, not just emotionally and socially, but actually cognitively less intelligent. IQ depends more on the right hemisphere than on the left. And most scientists and mathematicians who have made great discoveries have relied mainly on their right hemisphere, not on the left, although workaday people in either department may simply rely on procedures derived from the left hemisphere. So we can see this, and we can see the difference between, if you like, the radiograph of a skull and a living portrait of the head. So what are these two worlds like in brief? They derive from a difference of attention. I've explained this many times, but I'll explain it extremely briefly. Every creature that is going to survive has to solve a conundrum. It has to be able to pay a certain kind of attention to the world in order to grab what it needs, to get food, for example, or if it's a bird, perhaps to pick up a twig to build a nest. It needs to have very precisely targeted attention to a detail that it already knows what it is, and it knows it wants it, and there are no mysteries here. It needs to go straight for it without too much, I wonder if I've got it right or not. So it is in its nature downright. And this kind of attention is very useful for just that purpose of grabbing and manipulating the world, but not for understanding it or seeing the whole picture. And because you can't survive if you don't look out for predators at the same time you're looking out for your prey or your food, there needs to be another neuronal mass equipped to give a quite different kind of attention to the world. So on the one hand, you've got a predisposed attention to something you already know what it is, it's very precise, it's very detailed. And on the other hand, you've got a broad, open, uncommitted attention to everything else that may exist. It may be that predator, or it may be your kin, it may be your mate, it may be your offspring that you also need to be looking out for. Now, those two kinds of attention make quite different worlds. Attention is not just a brain function. Attention is the way you dispose your consciousness towards the world, with what aims, towards what values, drawn by what matters to that particular hemisphere. And of course we need both of these. And of course in the normal condition, a person who is healthy is drawing on both of these all the time. But that doesn't alter the fact that in themselves they produce quite different kinds of mental worlds. And they're like this. For the left hemisphere, everything is already known, it's certain, it's fixed, it is explicit, there's nothing hidden. It's abstracted from its context, including that of the body, it's general in nature, and it's fundamentally inanimate. It's a world that is known by its parts, what goes to make it up, a world where quantity is more important than quality. It is in fact a representation, not the living presence. Let me just gloss that. The word representation is an interesting one, isn't it? It means making present again after the fact when whatever it is no longer present. So a representation is something that stands in for when you are not actually in touch with the reality. And it is what the left hemisphere gives us. And nowadays, I would argue, we are so used to living in a world of representations that we no longer even realize that that's what we're doing. We're not living in the living presence, as if you like, of whatever it is. To the right hemisphere, something presences. It comes into being. It's nurtured into being in the right hemisphere, almost immediately taken up by the left, which says, oh yes, it represents this, it represents that, it goes in this category. That's how that hemisphere operates, which is very, again, useful, but not very good if your aim is to get a real, truthful vision of the world around you. And it also goes in for denial and has limited imagination, and this leads to an unwarranted optimism. So its basic way of being is to close down on a certainty, and it's a bureaucrat's dream. Whereas the right hemisphere is aware of what it doesn't know. It is aware of, in fact, the unknown, of looking out for anything that might be without preconception, and it therefore sees the new, the possible, rather than the certain, the implicit. Now, again, that word sounds small, but everything that really matters to us not only is implicit, but must remain implicit if it's to keep its value. If we take the things that ultimately matter to us, like love, friendship, faith, sex, art, mythology, music, all these things, if we make them explicit, it's like explaining a joke. They're just destroyed. And so they need to remain in that implicit place if they're to have their power, their value. So it's not just the implicit, but of course all that comes from context, because it sees the bigger picture. It doesn't see it isolated. It sees whatever it is as embodied, unique rather than general, and in a word, an animate universe, a world where the whole is never just the sum of the parts, where quality matters more than quantity, where the how is more important than how much, where the world is a living presence, and in place of the fatuous optimism of the left hemisphere, and if you doubt my use of the word fatuous there, I can give you clinical examples of how extreme it is, there is realism in the right hemisphere. So it is opening up to a possibility rather than closing down to a certainty. And as a result, it's a bureaucrat's nightmare. Now, when we come to philosophy, the role of attention towards one's object of concern governs what one finds. If one is concerned with knowing one's object in philosophy and being truthful to it, then it depends very much on how you attend, what you will find there. If attention is absent or present, if it is detached or engaged, if it's alienated or empathic, broad or narrow, sustained or piecemeal, it has the power to alter whatever it meets. And since our consciousness plays some part in what comes into being, the play of attention can both create and destroy, but it never leaves its object unchanged. So how you attend to something or don't attend to it matters a very great deal. The altered nature of attention, as we see with organic right hemisphere deficits, can appear to abolish whole parts of the world, collapse time and space, eviscerate emotion, and render the living inanimate. Attention is a profoundly moral act. And here are just a few snippets from philosophers recognizing how this works. So from Bergson, our thinking, and by that he meant the left hemisphere, immobilizes what in experience is forever in motion. There's a whole series of books implicit in that single sentence, and he wrote them. Whitehead, we think in generalities, the left hemisphere's categories, but we live in detail. The word detail is unfortunate. I think what he means is we live in things that are unique. I mean, detail might suggest the obsessional focus of the left hemisphere on a detail, but he couldn't possibly have meant that. What he meant was that there are, whereas in generalities there are no details, in living things which are unique there are. Dewey, neglect of context is the besetting fallacy of philosophical thought. In fact, he went on to say, there is no more grievous a mistake that can be made in philosophy than neglecting context. And everything I know would support that insight. And then Korzybski's the map is not the territory. So if there are these differences and how we attend changes what we find, and one of the ways of attending is typical of a hemisphere that gets things wrong all the time, and the other is more typical of a hemisphere which connects us to the world and helps us to understand it, to comprehend it, to take together, not just to apprehend it, to apprehend it, to grasp onto it, then it matters to philosophy. And, you can challenge this and tell me I'm completely wrong, but I would like to say in all modesty that I think that I have made a step forward for philosophy. Because if it is possible for the first time to be able to see this kind of thinking is typical of left hemisphere delusions, but this kind of thinking is much more typical of a right hemisphere approach, then we don't have to just go, as up till now we have, well, this school of philosophers thought this and this school of philosophers thought that. Take your pick. We don't need to shrug anymore. And the difference between the hemispheres is particularly obvious in the case of paradoxes. And in The Matter with Things, I have a chapter on the nature of logical paradox. And I think I look at, 25 to 30 paradoxes that are well-known ones. And I think what I can show is that in every case, the paradox arises from the distinction between the left hemisphere's take and the right hemisphere's take. And guess what? The right hemisphere's take is the one that needs no explaining because it tallies with experience. The left hemisphere's one is the weird one. So, for example, there is something called the dichotomy, which is one of Zeno's paradoxes. And I just use it because it's a classic example of what goes wrong when the left hemisphere starts to think it can understand things by taking it apart. Effectively, the dichotomy says that anything that you like, the distance between where you are and the door, can be divided in half, and then further into a quarter, and then further into an eighth, and a 16th, and a 32nd, and so on. Now, that series is obviously infinite, and the deduction is we will never get to the end of adding all those pieces of the distance, and so we can never go through the door. Now, in fact, we know we can go through the door. Experience tells us that every day, several times, I hope. So what has happened here is analysis, which started, paradoxes in the West start to come in with the ancient Greeks. I think around the time even of Heraclitus, but moving forward, of course, you get Zeno and so forth. And what is happening is, for the first time, people prized analysis as a way of understanding. And of course, it is a very useful tool, don't misunderstand me. I use it myself. It's a very useful procedure, but it shouldn't be mistaken for an understanding. And when they begin to analyze things, they travestied the nature of what they encountered. Analysis fragments an in reality indivisible whole. It tries to transform a seamless flow into a series of static instants. It represents, by definition, after the fact, what must be present as we go forward in order to be understood, and abstracts whatever it finds from the context of embodied experience. So what I think I've tried to explain so far is, why should we be interested in the brain? Why should we be interested in hemisphere differences? Why this could matter to philosophy? And now I want to move on to why this is important for a culture. Now, I mean, you might say, well, of course, a culture, a group of people, a society, a civilization can't have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, granted. But that's not as far as we can go. What happens particularly in a flourishing society, a growing civilization, is something partly to do with scale and how we communicate. Now, in the small groups below Dunbar's number of whatever it is, 130 or 150, we understood one another by direct speech, but also by implicit understanding of history, of emotions, of ethics, of tone of voice, facial expression, body posture, so many things that told us what was being communicated. But as communication takes place over much larger distances, which it does when a civilization develops an empire, or even when it becomes too large for that kind of acquaintance and knowledge to be present, and particularly when, which Socrates thought was a terrible thing, we started to write things down, then a whole different way of looking at what we mean by an understanding comes to the fore. In public speaking, in a debate like I'm possibly having with Steve or whatever it is we have later, the worst thing I could do would be to contradict myself. That's the way we feel. And yet actually a deep knowledge of truth shows, as Niels Bohr said, that deep truths and their opposites very often coincide and need to be present for one another. And this is an insight that is present throughout Eastern wisdom and is present in Heraclitus, right at the beginning of Western philosophy. So what we feel and what we understand implicitly, what we intuit and what we can imagine is not the same as what we tend to express in prose when we speak publicly or write publicly. And so a culture can become very subject to a certain way of thinking, which is by a notion of logical series, progressions of thought towards a certain goal. Whereas I believe that actually when we are approaching truth, what we're doing is not following a serial chain, but actually it would be more helpful to think of it as something like a photograph that's out of focus, just gradually coming into focus, and suddenly, I see what it is. That is indeed exactly the aha moments, robustly associated with the superior temporal gyrus in the right hemisphere. That is exactly the way described by great artists, but also by great mathematicians and scientists in how they came to their understandings. So I think, and I laid out in the second part of the Master and his Emissary, that in the West, we have gone through a series of phases. I wanted to look at the turning points in the history of ideas, because I started from an insight of a colleague, Louis Sass, professor, now retired, but a former distinguished professor of psychology at Rutgers, that the 20th century showed extraordinary likenesses in its thinking and in its art and in its philosophy to schizophrenia. Now, of course, neither he nor I think that suddenly in the 20th century we all became schizophrenic. But there is a strong connection, I can talk about it later if you want, between industrialization and schizophrenia. And it's interesting that most illnesses, mental illnesses that we recognize now, we can find descriptions of in ancient texts, but we can't find descriptions of schizophrenia until about the 18th century, when people started to move into cities. But what I want to just say is that I can show that schizophrenia is like an overdrive of the left hemisphere with a malfunctioning or non-functioning right hemisphere, in which the left hemisphere is trying to make up for a complete inability to understand in the normal way that we have gifted to us in the faculties of the right hemisphere. And so we can become seduced by all kinds of things. I just want, so I know I'm running out of time and annoying, but I'm just going to wind up in 5 minutes. This thing of the two souls, remember it was Faust, and there's something Faustian about the scientific hubristic mind that started with the scientific revolution at the end of the 17th century, went forward through the Enlightenment and to the present time. And it's of interest that other cultures than ours have become very sophisticated in science, sometimes a long time before our own, for example, the Chinese and the Egyptians. But they didn't go completely into this left hemisphere lock. And if you don't know it, I recommend the book Stephen Gore-Crodger's The Emergence of a Scientific Culture, Science and the Shaping of Modernity, 1210 to 1685, in which he goes into this thing that is rather special to the West. So previous patterns in the West, I think 3 times in around the 6th century BC in Athens, around the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire in Rome, and then again for ourselves in the Renaissance, there was a sudden efflorescence of everything, science, engineering, architecture, mathematics, but also, of course, the arts, music, poetry, drama. This happened 3 times in those places. And so, of course, there are differences, but I'm just drawing a very sketchy overview of the fact that each of these civilizations started almost explosively with something wonderful and then tailed off gradually into the sterility of the left hemisphere's take. And we can talk, I'm sure people want to ask me why. I have a number of reasons why. But at the moment, I just want to draw attention to a handful of things that show us how left hemispheric we are. The triumph of procedure over meaning in every walk of life. This is the story of both bureaucracy and AI. The 3 sources of fulfillment have been lost. These are well backed by research data. The 3 things that make us fulfilled are not material wealth. They are social integration. They are closeness to the natural world. And they are a closeness to whatever it is we mean by the sacred or the divine. We now live in a world that is socially disintegrated, alienated from nature, both our embodied nature and the natural world, and alienated from the divine. It's characterized typically, the left hemisphere, as black and white. It's got to be this, quick and dirty. I need to know the answer. What do you mean it might be either? Meanwhile, the right hemisphere is going, hang on, it could be something else. I don't want to listen to that. So now we have extreme points of view rather than civilized debate leading to a mutual understanding, an insistence on black and white thinking, dogmatism, anger, self-righteousness, and narcissism. Values, a need for total control, utility and power has become the only value. It is the value of the left hemisphere. While greater values, including beauty, goodness, truth, and love, are neglected or actively travestied in our culture, there's a lack of nuance, a neglect of context, the triumph everywhere of theory over experience, loss of the broader picture, loss of the concepts of skill and judgment, replaced by bureaucratic rules, procedures, and algorithms, a simultaneous abstraction and reification where we live in an entirely abstract world of symbols and thoughts and ideas, and at the same time the idea of matter as mere lumpen matter. Matter is very special, even if you believe there is nothing else in the universe but matter. After a few billion years, it gives rise to Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Matter did that. That's pretty amazing stuff. So uniqueness is being driven out by our relentless categorization. Quantities become the only criterion at the expense of quality, and reasonableness has been replaced by rationalization. And I'll leave it there. As you know, I'm capable of writing thousands of pages, and there's a lot more to the story.
Well, Iain, thank you so much for that flyover of certainly a plethora of themes that you have developed elsewhere. And of course, we know you could go on with those. So thank you for that. And Steve, I want to bring you onto the virtual floor here. And just to tell both of you, my role here will be Wu Wei. Right, effective non-interference. So I want to allow you to develop the dialogue for the next half hour or so and take it from dialogue to debate and back again wherever you'd like. And just encouragement to the audience, please use the Q&A function, and I'll be following along with that. When we transition to the Q&A, I'll be hoping to highlight some of those. So Steve, welcome, and we look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Iain. It was good to hear the excellent synopsis of your excellent thought. There's no danger we're going to have a big debate because I'm in alignment with you on just an amazing amount of things. I've been working on my own philosophy book intensely for the last 2 years. This will be my 5th, but I think this one is, coming to the fore. And I had read a master in his Emissary before, but when I got to read A Matter with Things, I got very excited because I felt like, wow, we're part of the same philosophical movement, right? An emergence in history, right? Which is bigger than all of us. And so the overlaps are remarkable. I'll just tick a few of those off. One is the central significance of the good, the true, and the beautiful. That is really the central focus of my forthcoming book. I think about the good, the true, and the beautiful as kind of interior energy. Emerson was famous for saying that every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact. And I think that the ubiquitous presence of physical energy in our universe could be at least fruitfully symbolically compared to the way that value drives the growth of the mind and the growth of culture and the evolution of the universe as a whole, right? I also was very pleased to see in there panentheistic kenosis theology, which is definitely my theory. Apophatic spirituality, really awesome. Virtues, I mean, these are the subjects that are near and dear to my heart. And of course, the dialectical relationship of opposites and paradoxes.
Yes.
And how, the Nicholas of Cusa, the ancients, many of them had this insight right. But the main focus of my thinking is how philosophy can come into its role again in history as a lever for further cultural maturity or social progress, if we can call it that. And I think we're on the cusp of philosophy helping us catalyze a new emergence in what Teilhard de Chardin called noosphere evolution. Right? There's ways to pronounce that, but I call it noosphere. And when we think about what we now know about evolution, right? That it's universal, that each human being is in some ways a microcosmic embodiment of the entire structure of evolutionary emergence. And when we come to learn more through philosophical insight, through these interior phenomena, how the emergence, the structure of emergence continues into the noosphere, right? And how philosophy has played a role, like from the ancient, golden age of ancient Greece, or in the Enlightenment, I think philosophy can play this role again. And so that brings up the question of, okay, well, you mentioned the emergence of industrial revolution and the 18th century, the emergence of the Enlightenment itself, right, as a hinge of history. I think if we look at it from the perspective of noosphere evolution, we can see how that emergence brought many good things, but also every one of these steps of emergence has dignities and disasters, right? Positives and negatives. And certainly I'd say left brain thinking is at least partially a product of the pathology of this modernist worldview, as I call it. And so one of the central tasks of philosophy in our age is to help our civilization, at least, the culture of the developed world, emerge beyond this left brain trap we found ourselves in, which you so elegantly describe, right? I mean, and if we became overly focused on the left as a result of the emergence of modernity and a step of cultural evolution, then focusing on the next step that can reclaim the right, the master can rein in the emissary. And, this is actually something that while, we can't socially engineer cultural evolution, I think we can garden for emergence, right? That we can, as I'm talking about in this forthcoming book, there's like new truth, science, the science of neurophysiology, the science of evolution, they're delivering all kinds of new truths, which have been, in a sense, held outside the membrane of physicalism. And by demonstrating how that framework is now exhausted, right? How it now is creating more untruth than truth, right? It started as method. When it became an ontological reality frame, then obviously it ran into all kinds of problems, as again, you've demonstrated. So this question of what comes next, I think when we look at noosphere evolution, we can see that in certain ways that modernity is already in the process of being transcended by what we frame as progressive postmodernity. But it's got its own disasters as well, its own pathology. So in other words, both of these are struggling, and their conflict is one of the things that's driving, the big problems of our world. But the way I see it is this dialectical progression, not just a Hegelian dialectic, but an evolutionary dialectic from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. We can begin to see how this progressive postmodern turn, not just in philosophy, but as a cultural whole, in the West, that this is staking out this opportunity to transcend modernity by being its antithesis, but the antithesis is not the end. It can't create a new whole. The new whole comes from the synthesis. And the next step, this postmodern, if you'll pardon the term, step of cultural evolution, catalyzed by the new philosophy that you represent, and I'm trying to represent as well, that this actually can lead to a cultural synthesis wherein not only can we transcend left brain thinking, but we can also re-include the dignities of all these cultural stages or steps, like the traditional, so many values in traditional culture that we've been alienated from, that we need to carry those forward. And the way to carry them forward is to tease apart the dignities from the disasters and include the best, transcend the worst in this synthetic move driven by this philosophical understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Yes, well, I agree with you that there's a lot there we have in common. And I think the question that I'd like to pick up is so how can we make philosophy more effective in helping us towards where we need to go, to make it more worthy of its title, The Love of Wisdom? And I must say that in many university philosophy departments, whatever goes on there is very far from the love of anything or anything to do with wisdom. So we need to get that back. I think there are a number of things that need to happen. And the first is to make sure that we don't operate in silos. So I mentioned, of course, and I think we'd probably all agree that the divorce between science and philosophy is a disaster. And I think philosophers tend to take a rather sort of superior view to science, that they don't need to dirty their hands with it. And scientists tend to think philosophers are a bit away in the clouds and not really relevant to the serious work of science. But these are terrible caricatures which lead to misunderstandings. But partly I think philosophy has itself to blame. I think it's trivialized itself. A lot of people have pointed to how, you know, it's disappeared up its own fundament in the 20th century and stopped really having powerful things to say to a civilization that has been in crisis. So we need to repair that bridge. We also need to repair the bridge very strongly between philosophy and theology. And most philosophers think that theology is by definition a non-truthful subject, and therefore, but that of course is the problem of the way that they think. And I don't think that philosophy can really survive unless it also takes into account what, for want of a better term, one might call theology, but one might otherwise phrase as a revived imagination for the beautiful and the sacred. And you know, this is, I go into this and you'll know this, that imagination, which nowadays people equate with untruth and going off somewhere other than reality, is indeed the only way we have a chance of getting into reality. And this was very clearly laid out in the most sophisticated period of modern Western philosophy, I believe, which is the period around the end of the 18th and the early 19th century, with people like Schelling and Coleridge and the Schlegels and Hegel and Fichte. I don't want to sound like Monty Python, but you know the business I'm talking about. So I think getting back into it, a sense of that, is very important. And I suppose what I tried to do in The Matter of Things, because it does set out to broach that question, what can we take to be true, at least more true than its opposite? And I begin in science and I end in the realm of theology. So I think that, and in the middle, I hope there's philosophy. So I think those three things need to be held together, and even held together with the arts. You know, these things shouldn't be siloed. It's not just that it's a problem in academia, but it's a problem for our culture that they are. And I think that education, I'll stop rabbiting in a minute, but I think that education should be once more refocused on the humanities. Not that we should stop teaching technical subjects. Tech and STEM are important, and they were an important part of my own upbringing. But the idea that somehow they're the only things that matter because they will, you know, crunch out the goods and help you make money and, you know, make the economy flourish. But actually the key is the word, the humanities. We've lost sense of what a human being is. We're radically deluded about that we're machines, we're zombies, we're artifacts. We can be hybrid with a computer. No, we are ensouled bodies and embodied souls. And this is a very important insight. And I think, I mean, of course, people will object, well, I know what he means by that. But the trouble with this kind of thing is you can't go into the detail. But let's just leave it there. But that is very, very important. And we need to get that back into the way people are trained to think.
Yeah, excellent. And let me just add to that, that I see science, philosophy, and, there's not really an adequate term, theology, religion, spirituality, where those terms are evolving in themselves. But I see those as the science, philosophy, and religion, let's call it, the three legs of the stool of human knowledge, that each are indispensable, right? And that philosophy ideally serves to bridge and separate science and religion, bridging it by, that is acting as a mediator between them, but separating, like at the three legs of the stool, if the legs come too close together, the stool falls over, right? So if science tries to colonize philosophy or spirituality, then it ends up, going. It becomes, instead of being a source of greater human knowledge, it becomes a barrier to greater human knowledge.
Yes. So you beautifully. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but you just so beautifully described the role of the corpus callosum, which is both to unite and to divide and separate. Right. And I quote from the Upanishads, this thing: there, at the middle of the heart, there is the bridge that keeps the two worlds apart. A bridge keeps them apart. Beautiful. Carry on. Sorry to have interrupted.
So this idea that that theology can really help us both philosophically, scientifically, culturally. One of the ideas that I'm playing around with, I'll run it by you, is that the part of the reason that the human body is divided neurologically into these hemispheres is that it's a fractal representation of the structure of the universe as a whole. In other words, that as above, so below, right? It's a cliche, but the way I see it is that this motif of part and whole, right, which the left and the right represent so vividly, is really an expression of the whole of the universe, which I think of pantheistically as infinite and finite. The finite became a part of the infinite 13.8 billion years ago. And that motif of part and whole interacting, through evolution is refracted throughout the universe at every scale, like a fractal. So we can begin to see how the human body is an embodiment of this structure of emergence, not just in, the levels from, atoms to molecules to cells to organs to organism, but also in very important details like the way our brain is set up. So for example, why are there three primary values? Why not, we can have love in there. We don't want to put too much weight on the three. But for the same reason that there's three primary colors that can represent all the colors on our screen, right? Where there's three cones in our eye that give the ability to have RGB be the full spectrum. And I'd say there's three mental faculties in a basic human being, and that is feeling, thought, and will, right? And the good, the true, and the beautiful correspond to those faculties, which is why, that they can cover the waterfront and qualify the world, why they're the primary values like primary colors. So seeing, I think that we're on the cusp of a new realization of the significance of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and how these values are, in a sense, a threefold reflection of, infinite, finite, and evolution itself.
Yes, well, that was very rich. Thank you a lot there. And you'd be surprised how much of it I do agree with. I mean, you sounded like you were throwing something out. Not surprised. Particularly on the fractal element, because of course, in essence, we can see fractality everywhere in the physical world, but also, as you were quoting earlier, the embodied world is also a metaphor of a world beyond that. And there's two things here. The threeness, which is a very interesting topic, but the one I wanted to focus on is what you call whole and part, and I think that's absolutely right, and I call them that too. But for these purposes, I call them the force for division and the force for union. To me, probably the most meaningful utterance of a profoundly wise man, Goethe, was his insight that the whole work of nature It's dividing the united and uniting the divided. And he goes on to talk about it. But I think those forces do exist everywhere. And I even believe that the left and right hemispheres are instantiations of those drives that go beyond the living. So I don't think there is if I may just expand a little, I don't think there's a hard and fast barrier between the living and the unliving. So I think animacy is like inanimacy, but with the gain turned up enormously. So even the inanimate world actually can be responsive. It does respond to certain force fields, to certain elements. It recombines, it creates new architecture, it creates complexity, all of that. But what life does is to make all this 1,000-fold more possible, and particularly to respond to the drives towards goodness, beauty, and truth, but also possibly this dividing and uniting element. So I've been in conversation a number of times, about over half a dozen now, but lately I had a conversation with Michael Levin, who's Professor of Developmental Biology at Tufts. And what he is, in a way, spearheading is a revolution in biology in which, belatedly, 100 years late, it catches up with physics. Physics found out that it wasn't enough to think of things as mechanical. In fact, in the end, nothing could be described in this way correctly. But biologists have gone on thinking of organisms as machines, which is a fundamental error. It doesn't mean that there is nowhere in those complex organismic structures that you can find a chain of causation, but that doesn't in itself make it a machine. So what I think he is now interested in is the point I made, that this left and right seems to come up in, he's doing something rather alarming, I think, but anyway, good for him. He's creating small, new engineered organisms, and they find their way towards things that seem to be primal. And in a less disturbing realm, you can frustrate the development of an embryo in various ways. And amazingly, it can quite quickly find a way around the block to rejoin the path that it needed to be on, which is very odd because a mechanism can't do that. It has to have a notion of exactly what it is that it's doing here. So it's drawn by something, not just pushed from behind. Now, if that's the case, I think it's being drawn by these forces and form fields. That how does a tadpole know that its head has to reconfigure in 4 dimensions into the very different head of a frog? Where are these forms? They're certainly not in the DNA. So this is part of the problem we have, is that we have to take into account there are forces, there are drives, and everybody interesting in the 20th century thought there were forms and drives, Jung and Freud and so on. They weren't so stupid. I think these exist everywhere in the cosmos. So the cosmos is in evolution. You said earlier, all living things are in evolution. That is true. But I would say the cosmos is in evolution as well, from something very simple to something very complex and very beautiful and utterly creative. So the thrust behind the universe, if there is one word for it, it is creation, which is interestingly what we've always called it.
Indeed. Well, that's what Whitehead said, right? Creativity is the ultimate matter of fact. Right, it's not technical stuff; it's creativity.
No.
So I would say, properly understood with notions like Bergson's élan vital and the idea that life is matter that chooses. It's got something in it that allows it to go around and find a way, as they say. I would say that I can't roll out the philosophical argument for this conclusion, but I'll just state it anyway, and that is that the good, the true, and the beautiful are the essential directions of evolution itself. That's where the universe is going, is toward the experience and creation of intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is it's not just complexity, it's making the universe more real, right? Step by step, experience by experience. And you mentioned the forces, they've been called in evolution differentiation and integration, right? And genius like Teilhard de Chardin, he kind of has that famous phrase, unity differentiates. And we could also say the same, that differentiation unifies these forces,
Exactly.
working them out. And again, I would say it's an expression of this motif of part and whole, which is
Yes.
the signature of the creator in the creation.
Quite. And what's also interesting is the requirement for opposition. So we need to hold both of these things, not just say, well, we need this for a while and then we need that for a while, but we actually need both of them all the time to be working together. And so opposition can be fulfillment. Opposition can be the path to creation. In fact, I don't believe that anything comes into being properly without a degree of opposition. So opposition is not just as we think of it negative. In fact, negation is not always negative. Negation may be very creative. The obvious example is sculpture, in which you throw stuff away and there it is, you don't put it together. But negation is a very powerful force. And then when you said the direction of the universe is beauty, goodness and truth, I could read minds. One of those things I've just taken up recently in the audience going, well, yes, but there's also an awful lot of pain and ugliness and so on. Well, but I think that overwhelmingly the creative force of goodness and beauty overwhelm their opposites. Goodness can embrace evil, but evil can never embrace good. So what I think is that these forces are both needed and they're both represented in the universe. And that degree of, if you like to say, resistance is better than opposition. Resistance, that degree of resistance allows something new to come into being. Resistance is important. I mean, I sometimes give the example of friction. You know, what is friction? It's what stops motion. But by the way, it's also what starts motion. If you didn't want, if there was no friction, I couldn't move. You know, you couldn't move. So these things, that's why we need to get back to a more sophisticated way of thinking, where we don't just think, this is good in the abstract, therefore we need more of this and more of this and more of this, and none of this other stuff. But actually this other stuff is part of the being of the thing that we think is good. And if you pursue that track too far, you will end up with the opposite of it, the thing you most feared.
Sure. Look far enough out in the universe, you'll just see the back of your head. but the idea that I mean, I don't mean to suggest that it's just a bed of roses. Obviously, here in the finite, opposite is our permanent condition, and that's indeed that's how we're pushing off against the partial toward the greater and greater whole.
Yes.
I would say that negation, you mentioned that term. I mean, that's another word for this synthesis that I talked about, right? The postmodern synthesis is the negation of the negation, at least partially, right? And so these are recognizing that these problematic life conditions that we face at this time in history, these are certainly dire and threatening and need to be taken very seriously. But at the same time, we can turn them around and see them as golden opportunities, creating necessary pressure for the next step, right? The next enlightenment. And I don't mean a return to modernity. I mean something bigger, right? Something that brings back the good, the true, and the beautiful. Something that integrates science, philosophy, and religion. And it's a very exciting time to be alive while this is occurring.
I agree with you. And as the Chinese curse goes, may you live in exciting times. But I do think I'm hopeful that we can do something. I'm not particularly optimistic, but I am hopeful because people are far more resourceful than we perhaps give them credit for. And there have been times in history when I'm sure they thought, oh, it's all up, we're all going to die out. But in fact, that didn't happen. And I think that one problem is the notion of size. So people think, I'm so small, what can I do? But the realm in which things really matter is the realm of the psyche. You will only ever know what your consciousness, your experience tells you. There is nothing else you will ever know. And what that consciousness tells you comes out of an encounter, a two-way interaction between our inner consciousness and whatever it is out there, which is also, I believe, conscious, whatever it is that is more than us. And so our way of attending, our way of thinking, our quality of life, our values make a difference to not just ourselves, but to the coming into being of everything. And it, as I think Margaret Mead said, no movement ever came about except from a small group of individuals. A small group of individuals who thought the right way could make a huge difference. Don't be overwhelmed by the size of Google. It's if 3% of us changed our hearts and minds, and that is what needs to change. It's not our cognition all the time. We don't need to become cleverer in cognition. We need to become much, much wiser, and that comes from somewhere else in us.
Right. So what is it that we've seen in history? How have new forms of culture or more evolved forms of civilization, if you will, how have those come into being? I would say that that it's new truth, new beauty, and new ideals of morality that have brought about the social cohesion to create new steps of development. And I think that the folks who are on this call, who are participating in this, or the folks who watch it after the fact on YouTube, just being able to metabolize the values of this new philosophy, if you will, that helps create this intersubjective structure, the beginnings of it, the seed crystal of it, that can lead to a significant growth in our in our right-brained understanding and in the ability to create it all comes down to agreement, right? If we could just agree around things that were emergently beautiful, true, and good, this would create a new structure in society, and I think it's happening now. But we can't take it for granted. I certainly don't view it in a deterministic way. I see it as
No,
free will, as you and I agree,
no,
it's an organ of perception for the good, right? Because if you
yes,
didn't have
yes,
a choice, it wouldn't be a moral decision, right? So being
no,
able to see that this faculty is real and it's what's driven civilization from the
yes,
beginning, and what opens us to the future and allows things to be
yes,
open and not determined. These are
yes,
big new truths that, even though many of them have
yes,
been around for
yes,
thousands of years, they're coming around again, right? We're going on the turn of the spiral where we're going to rediscover these things at a higher level, with the benefit of having gone through science and gone through the degradation of the environment and all the things that are the catalysts of this next emergence. But the idea is that the degree of our transcendence is ultimately determined by the scope of our inclusion. I think that's a lesson of this structure of evolutionary emergence. So we can, by re-including things that have been lost, these are the
oh yeah,
essential elements that create the synthesis that we now need.
negating the negation, in fact,
Yes,
yes.
indeed.
No, that is what we need. Good.
We should
Yeah,
transition now. This has been an extraordinarily
yeah,
stimulating dialogue, certainly theoretical at many points, sparks of practical application as well. But I think for sake of time, let's transition. And I wonder if we can focus first on, maybe it'd be easier for us to, of course, go to the theoretical, but I do want to bring it to the practical, and in particular in the context of children. Now, you both have children. Um, I assume you're both glad that you do. I'm not just being comedic there. I've been reading literature recently that suggests, well, it's not a really good thing that we have kids, and perhaps existence is
no,
a harm, and we shouldn't have children. But let's assume, in the context of values, bringing life into being is a good thing. And so here's the
mm,
practical question from Ellen Cool. She says, how can we use this hemispheric information in raising conscious children? Do we identify the left and or the right side of characteristics to form a better understanding of each individual child's way of being in the world? And how do we use this to teach them? So I guess the broader question is surrounding the education, the rearing of the next generation, of future generations, in light of this transition that we're talking about. I suspect both of you may have perspectives on that.
yes. Well, I certainly wouldn't wish to be prescriptive, and in some ways, I wonder if the question assumes a too high level of abstraction and conscious thinking, whereas I suspect the questioner is capable of being intuitively a good parent, and we kind of don't need to be told in some ways. I mean, there are certain people who do need to be told that that's not a good way to raise a child, I agree. But if we are the sort of concerned person the questioner is, it seems to me that your intuitions will tell you that probably it's not a good idea, for example, to allow the child simply to sit in front of a screen all the time. It would occur to you that it would be a very important idea to share parts of life as much as possible with the child, involve them in things, meals for a start, and daily activities, allow them to explore their imagination with good books, you know, starting with simple ones and so forth, and telling them stories, and making sure that the school they go to pays attention to developing a sense of that much more difficult thing to grasp and write down in a few handy words, what it means to be human. And I think that children are naturally, not all of them, but I think that most healthy children are naturally drawn to explore the things that they don't in a way have to be taught. Morality, for example. And I only use that as an example because you think, so, okay, they need to be more moral, so what moral code? But actually, I think inside them they have it, and they need to see you model it, and they need to see their teachers model it, and they need to be able to talk about it. So that's the sort of thing I'd say. I wouldn't be prescriptive about you do this, you do that, the other, although I've ended up making a few suggestions. But I think it's to do with, again, a whole disposition, your disposition to the child, your disposition to the world, and what you communicate to the child about his or her disposition to the world.
Excellent. Let me add that, again, with the same considerations about not being prescriptive or, inevitably being abstract, this is a philosophical discussion. But as a parent, it's very, I think the good parents are aware of the need to make sure that their children are, they're getting good nutrition, right? That they're getting the major food groups, that they're being well fed and they're not eating too much junk. Well, the same goes for their what you might call their value metabolism, right? And if you understand value not as some abstract thing, but as the good, the true, and the beautiful, that nutrifying your children with value experiences, right? Taking them to the national park, taking them to the museum, reading, meaningful works to them that they can understand at their level. That making sure that your kids have a full complement of goodness, truth, and beauty in their lives, and approaching that as a rubric for parenting, I think, is just one of the numerous applications of this philosophy of value energy, as I call it.
Yeah, beautiful, both of you. Thank you for that. So if we start with the younger context of children, let's now, as it were, elevate to, the adult frame. We often act like children, although we see this in the political sphere, etc. But the whole question of value, to me, of course, is central to my work, and I've be influenced by each of you. But there's a couple questions that talk about the opposition involved in value. And Iain, you mentioned essentially an asymmetry among values in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And Steve, you've talked about the difficulty of competing goods as they meet in the evolution of culture and civilization, because we have this tendency so often to say one side is good, one side is evil. In fact, what we see often is the clashing of competing goods. And I just wonder what advice you have for us, for our leaders, as we continue to struggle into this next version of ourselves. How do we deal with this conflict of competing goods, and what wisdom can we bring to this whole situation? Because again, I think we need to get away from this hyperpolarization, Steve, as your institute is imagining, and Iain, you as well, recognizing the good on both sides is something that I think is going to help us evolve. So curious, any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, again, I come back to schooling, not because we need to just be talking about children, but because, as Wordsworth said, the child is father of the man. I mean, children have become the future. And it sounds perhaps a slightly dodgy idea, but I think it's got a great deal to be said for it. I believe that children, before they leave school, should be taught several things, which I was taught. One is to argue a position that you believe in, and then to argue the exact opposite, and you will be rated on how well you make the case for the opposite side. That is a very useful technique to have in your quiver. I think they should be taught mediation skills, how to make two parties that appear to have no understanding of one another approach one another, and in some ways to do a sort of version of what is couple therapy. You don't have to be a couple to benefit from it. You just have to be two disagreeing people. In couple therapy, the principle is that one party speaks and the other party doesn't interrupt. But when it's the turn for the other party to speak, they don't just spiel away. The first thing they're asked to do is repeat, what did you just hear said? And that is such a revealing thing, and often helps to resolve things quite quickly. I never meant that at all. I meant this, And so to do that and to be taught, goodness, aren't debating skills taught in the schools where you just don't interrupt, but you listen, and you don't just shout and scream and say, well, you're an arsehole. You sort of, you make a case. Is this gone out of our education? If not, why is it that people can no longer argue or discuss civilly among themselves? It may have a lot to do with the medium, to do with, I think social media is, I say it out of ignorance because I have never involved myself with it, but I see the damage is so great, I don't want to. But I think that this probably is unhelpful in this direction. It alienates, it polarizes, and it dumbs down because you can only say so many words in a tweet.
Yeah, in my response, I would pick up on what Iain brought up earlier regarding the insight, that the opposite of a small truth is a falsehood, but the opposite of a big truth is another great truth. And this begins to shine the light on I think, a new field of opportunity for us to understand through philosophy, not in any kind of reductionistic way, but to see if we begin to see value as at least a symbolically equivalent of energy or behaving in a certain way like energy in the driving of consciousness and culture, we can see that value has a kind of physics, right? That there are natural behaviors that we can discover, and they're not physics, of course, is just, I don't mean that we're going to reduce them to physics in any way, but we're going to understand their natural behaviors. And one of the natural behaviors of value is this polarity effect, or this coincident opposite effect. And this understanding of polarities, right, it's given rise to this whole new field within business, primarily of polarity theory or polarity management. And it involves working with two kinds of good, right? And so we've developed this into a kind of a political method, which we call values integration, right? Below the level of political parties or even political interests, there's a level of bedrock values. And at that level, most people of good sense and good faith can agree, even though they may never be able to agree about their differing interests. They can agree about values. And it's at that level of values that we can begin to create the kind of relationship of challenge and support that is one of the insights from this physics of value, that working with the polarity as an indestructible thing that continuously reoccurs, we can see that the value creating capacity of both is partially determined by the moderating influence of the other, right? That's a basic principle. And you've brought out in your book, Iain, books. But we're on the cusp of appreciating how people can find new levels of agreement by understanding how values work, and how appreciating that your own position is ultimately interdependent with the good values of your opponents.
Another context in which this value discussion is intensified, and we haven't yet found a way forward, is in the context of course, artificial intelligence. And there's been a lot of agreement between you, and this might be another area where you agree, but just looking through some of the various questions in the chat here, it seems that we have to find a way forward. When we think about the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of culture, we have to understand our relationship to AI. And it's rather hard to do that, disentangling it from, Ray Kurzweil, the religious or spiritual dimensions, and there's utopian dimensions to the whole discussion. And then there's practical and utilitarian dimensions. So Matt Siegel, for example, our friend at California Institute for Integral Studies, asks, Iain, might one possible and perhaps more helpful outcome of the rise of AI technology be that many left hemisphere functions are offloaded, freeing up human beings to live more in a right hemisphere dominant consciousness? And there's several other questions that are suggesting that as well. But this whole AI discussion in the context of values in the hemisphere hypothesis, what can we say about that?
Well, thanks, Matt. And I appreciate that you're here. That's great. I I have thought about that, of course, but I don't think, I'm afraid, that it's very likely. I think it's more likely that two things will happen, that we will, and I think it's already happening, that we're thinking more machine-like ourselves, and that things are not offloaded, but actually intensified by the processes that bade fair to offload. So, for example, there was a time when we were not going to need to use paper, but in fact the proliferation of machines means that more and more paper is used. Various systems were supposed to be smartened in such a way as to make routine processes much quicker and more efficient. Actually, a process that used to take 5 minutes because you lifted a phone and talked to a real human being somewhere else now takes a morning while you get into MCS like self-referring loops, going from platform to platform and finding that the thing that you want isn't there anyway. And this is a waste of our time. It's a criminal waste of our time. And I believe the world is just going to become more proceduralized. I also think that, just to throw in the other one, I don't think that we can help make machines ethical, because ethics is not a matter of cognition. Indeed, I think it's a very good point that utilitarianism is in its very nature the precise opposite of a moral position, which is not to calculate, but instead to feel what is intrinsically right. And that feeling of what is intrinsically right is important and helpful and is in us. And, we've talked about the great virtues, goodness, beauty, and truth, but we haven't talked about things like, which I'd just like to briefly mention, like magnanimity, generosity, bravery. These are all actually very important, and they're also going missing from our world, but they don't mean anything to a disembodied being that can never die. And it's ridiculous. So we need to be very, very clear that if we go on with AI, it has got to be under our control. But what I now read is that the people who are closest to the core of this, the people who are really able to make the big decisions, are the people who are most giving the warning signs, but at the same time just going on doing more of it. It's as though, like the Pied Piper of Hamlet, they're being led into the cleft in the rocks. They see where they're going, but they just carry on further into it. They're driving us all into it.
Hmm.
Sure, I could chime in there. In 2023, when the AI kind of first burst upon the scene and was available commercially, for consumers, I wrote a paper called "The Spiritual Significance of the Rise of AI." I certainly acknowledge the risks, but I did focus on some of the positives. We'll have to see how it plays out in history. I think I agree with Iain that the reification of mechanical thinking that AI represents is a leveraging of the pathology of modernity, right, and utilitarianism, and all of the kind of negative results that have come from this emphasis on left brain thinking and its pathologies. So I see it, as you might imagine, as both positive and negative. I think that even the negatives can be positive because they can help create this problematic pressure that I mentioned earlier regarding this catalyst for further evolution. But of course, these things are not inevitable. The deterioration or decline, we're certainly seeing both growth and decay. And whether the decay will overcome the growth in the near term, or whether the growth can really live up to its promise of bringing about the next cultural renaissance, we'll have to see. But AI is going to factor prominently in it, both negatively and positively.
Mm-hmm.
Emotions, I'd just like to say emotions and the body, I'll just say that they're very important parts. And the way we think now, we think we're something like cognitive machines. We're brains in a vat, but we're not brains in a vat. Our bodies and our emotions and our intuitions that come from that and the imagination that comes from that are not cognitive. And it's this lack of the cognitive that
Yes,
matters.
you can't hear the music, right? It's not embodied. That's one
Can't
of
hear the music.
Yeah, that's one of the ways.
Who is it who said they can read the notes but they can't hear the music? And that is the difference between the human and the machine.
And I mean, in some ways, that puts more emphasis on this human ability to discern things that AI will be blind to always.
And what also worries me, sorry, we're doing something important here, but what also very much worries me is that people will be tempted to say, oh, of course we can do this, we can put a moral code in, we can put in, you must do this, you mustn't do that. But of course all that reflects is the thinking of some possibly slightly unusual person in Silicon Valley. It doesn't represent what goes on inside each of us, is that we have a moral sense, we have a conscience, and it's complicated.
That the philosophy of virtues is so relevant to this because it overcomes utilitarian thinking and deterministic thinking and really the gestalt, right? The whole. That's how virtues work. And
yes.
The opportunity to recreate a virtues culture is one of the elements of this next Renaissance, that we're working for.
Yes.
Well, let's take it a slightly different direction now. That was wonderful. And certainly we're all influenced, at least us three, but several in the crowd, I imagine, by Whitehead. And this whole discussion, the re-entrance of value, is central to his metaphysics. And it's chapter 5 in Science in the Modern World, titled The Romantic Reaction, which he's praising the poets, he's praising the artists for re-including what in the scientific perspective of his time was excluded. And so the larger question, and there's been several in the discussion here, is the question of the arts, the question of poetry, the question of literature. Iain, I mean, your early work as a literary scholar, and you moved away from that eventually. But I think these whole themes of the broader artistic dimensions of the humanities as catalysts for value, it seems to me that any evolution of our culture has to rediscover the elements of the arts. And I think of Whitehead's saying that his Bible in his youth was essentially the Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley.
Yes,
and
particularly Wordsworth. Yeah.
Go ahead, Iain.
Sorry,
but just the arts, please. Yeah, the role of the arts.
Yeah. In fact, I think the acme for him was Wordsworth's The Prelude, which is pretty much the same for me. So no, I mean, although we didn't talk about the arts, they're there all the time in certainly what I'm concerned with. And I think that they are the medium through which we express things that are more complex and important as lures or drivers, or whatever you'd like to call it, of our ethical nature, of our love of the world. The world is a beautiful and complex gift, and the trouble is that the way we think now is reductive all the time. We try and explain away the song of the nightingale, which largely happens once it's finished mating and done all the job. It's then decided, it's time to sing. These things aren't just utilitarian in the way that they've been made out to be, and in visioning them in this way, we lose sight of the beautiful. And I have to say that I think the 20th century art world, which was rather schizoid and extremely strange, and governed by theory rather than feeling, governed by ideas rather than embodiment, led us into places where the beauty was either sidelined or deliberately attacked. And in some recent works of art, I mean, they are just childish statements of disrespect for the beauty of art. They may get a Turner Prize, but they're crap nonetheless, and actually literally they often are crap. So this is a very bad place to have taken the arts to. And music also lost its way in the 20th century, but I'm very glad to see that there are some wonderful composers now coming forward who actually respect the fact that music can be more than just noise. And also, of course, the popular culture has never really lost that. So in in jazz and in the folk and pop world, these things have carried on. But in the intellectual world, we attacked goodness. We said it doesn't mean anything except a score on a card of values. Truth is what we make up. Truth is, you have one truth, I have another truth. Who's to say which is the right truth? And beauty is whatever I think it is. This was nihilism, vandalism. It went through the universities. It still needs rooting out. We need to re-engage seriously with, it will be lost unless we re-engage seriously with goodness, beauty, and truth.
Steve, any
Well, first, let me
that?
just compliment Ian for what he just said. That's so good. And let me add that that this revalorizing value, if you will, recognizing that it's not just a subjective preference, but it's an ontological reality in the universe.
Exactly.
You mentioned Whitehead, and one of my favorite ideas from him is that how does consciousness evolve, right? How can we, beyond character growth? I mean, there's many ways that it evolves. But at least one way that Whitehead emphasizes, and that David Ray Griffin in his interpretation of Whitehead really brings out, is that consciousness evolves when it expands the scope of what it can value. And the arts, when at their best, do just that. Right, they transport us into higher states of being by my little idea of the three legs of the stool. Well, art's probably a fourth leg. It's an approach to truth when at its best. I saw with modernity, it was able to differentiate the value sphere so that art could be its own thing. Postmodernity has tried to collapse them again, making all art political, right? And that just makes mostly for bad art. So allowing art to focus on the beautiful and recognizing that beauty is real and it's what we need deep down. It's spiritual nutrition, and that it's an evolution.
Yeah, and it's not like, oh, well, politics is serious, but beauty's just entertainment. No, beauty is a guide to the things that are ultimately of importance. As Dostoevsky said, the world will be saved by truth. And that sounds odd, and Solzhenitsyn himself quoted those words and said for a long time I couldn't see how that could be right. And of course, superficially, it doesn't sound right. But truth can be travestied and you may not notice. Goodness may be travestied, and a whole set of new rules are said to be good, and you may not even notice them, you just follow them. But when beauty is travestied, you know it's travestied. You know it is wrong, and you know when beauty speaks to you, and it speaks to you of the important things. The beauty is not just fringe to it. In the great art of the West, and of the East as well, but in the great art of the West, beauty has been the vehicle whereby a spiritual sense has been perpetuated in people. It is the embodiment of spiritual sense, along with beautiful spiritual music and so forth. So we shouldn't turn our backs on this, and we shouldn't vilify it, and we should make sure that our children know what a heritage of richness there is there. It would be so tragic for them to lose it.
I've thought a lot about Whitehead's idea that goodness and truth are ultimately forms of beauty. What does that mean, right? And at least my interpretation of it is that, he's talking about beauty in terms of visible perfection, right? That is, it's the presence of the infinite in the finite. The flashing through, right? But it requires us. I mean, that's part of our role as agents of evolution and creatures of the universe, is that it takes the infinite to see the infinite. The fractal fragment of infinity that lives within each of us is what gives us free will, and it's what gives us this power to see the beautiful, the true, and the good, to recognize the infinite as it shines through. And that's how it acts as this lure, right? This direction, this way forward into greater states of perfection.
Well, and the whole arc of value in terms of evolution too, which both of you have emphasized. Ian, this great line that Whitehead makes, that if the goal of existence were to persist, we'd never would have exceeded beyond the rocks,
Yes.
But that there's this increased drive to experience intrinsic worth, Steve, as you mentioned it, to live better, or to what is it? Just what's the whole line? To live better, to increase in value. There's threefold step there. Thank you. Live well, and live better.
Well, yes. No, I mean, the only way we can account for the expensive and counterintuitive idea of a system that uses a lot of energy for a while. It doesn't ultimately disprove the second law of dynamics, but it has to actually has to go against the second law of thermodynamics. The only reason for this expense is that it is leading to something that can reflect value, not just make value. We never just make up values. We either respond to them or we fail to respond to them. And whatever the creative drive behind the cosmos is, it is seeing itself and its value. And I think this was my understanding of Whitehead, that the creation and the creating force, God or whatever, is finding out about itself and unfolding the potential that is there and seeing what it is. And that by bringing the potential into the actual, that then further increases and alters the nature of the potential and so forth.
Thank you. I want to be mindful of time, since I know, Iain, it's getting later on your end and lunch is calling for many others. But I'd like to just ask one final question that relates to different themes in the chat here too, and that is the whole context of values, the metaphysical context. So, Iain, you've stressed the primacy of consciousness. Steve, you've both used the language of panentheistic inclusion, and I just wonder how you understand the significance of individuals intuiting the sense of the sacred, Iain, as you've called it, and why that is so important moving forward. I know you got a lot of flack, Iain, in some cases for including that final chapter, which I know took a lot from you existentially. It's, the topic of God is no small matter, certainly. And Steve, I'm certain that you get your own criticisms for, why take this step into the theological domain? It's not at all necessary.
Yes.
But for both of you, I think it is a necessary step and it is important. So maybe we can conclude with a few comments on, God. And the importance of that notion moving forward.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's no scope to go into it, but I do very strongly believe that we could do all kinds of things that are good. We could reverse the pollution of the seas. We could stop deforestation. I don't know if we can actually, but if we could do all those things. But it really wouldn't add up to anything if we remained the same selfish, entitled, greedy people that we are. And when Solzhenitsyn looked back at the evils of the 20th century, which were so colossal, he said the only explanation, as far as I'm concerned, is that people have forgotten God. And I think that we need, I'm not at all frightened to say that if we don't search for God again and find out what is meant in that immensely rich and complex but extremely difficult to specify word, one that can only be specified through experience, not really in language, although I made an attempt to do it in 111 pages in that last chapter. So I think it is very, very important, is all I can say. And I think it is a sense that is in all of us. We've been taught that it's cognitively a childish mechanism, a reaction to certain feelings and so forth. But I think this is a typical example of reductionism and materialism gone wrong. And I argue strongly why they cannot possibly deal with the physical world, never mind with the spiritual world.
Sure. Well, let me just respond by saying that I really loved the part of In the Matter with Things, where you talk about the names of ultimate reality and how an apophatic approach is so important, because when we name it, we immediately make it what it's not. I quote that in my forthcoming book. It's really excellent. But at the same time, the idea that we talked about earlier, that creativity is the ultimate matter of fact, what we can read right off what science has delivered about our evolving universe, between something more keeps coming from something less. And then, there's fine tuning. And I mean, just the scientific facts themselves are showing us that the universe doesn't make sense without some kind of creative principle, right? We don't have, it doesn't have to be, we can certainly eschew anthropomorphic notions, but at the same time, the idea that it's an accident, that's magical thinking, right? So especially if the creativity is the ultimate matter of fact. I think that one of the most amazing things that we're beginning to discover, and I think it's one of the grounds of this new philosophy that we're both involved with, is that the universe is intelligible, amazingly, right?
Extraordinary.
Over the past several hundred years,
Yes.
what we've learned, that time began, that the universe has evolved, that the human body is a replica of the whole thing. It's just so mind-blowing. And just the very fact that the universe is intelligible leads us to understand that while we may never be able to make intelligible the ultimate mystery, while we have to always have that understanding that it's beyond us, we can certainly evolve our understanding of whatever the creative source of the universe is. And I think we're in the process of doing that now.
Absolutely. And it doesn't matter that we can't necessarily ever reach it, or at least not in the condition that we're in now. The journey, not the arrival, matters, if you like. And, there's a wonderful rabbinical saying, which is, you are not tasked with completing, you're not asked to complete this task, but you are also not permitted to desist from it. Now, that is a very good way of thinking about both the search for truth and the search for God, which, of course, are facets of one and the same thing.
Well, and we've arrived, I think, to the way in which Whitehead concludes his latest book, Modes of Thought, when he says philosophy begins in wonder, and in the end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains. Well, I think we do need to conclude, and I want to thank you, Iain and Steve, for such an extraordinary dialogue, and we'll be certainly wrestling with these ideas. And thank all of you who have attended virtually. We will be posting this recording as well. And just a reminder and encouragement to everyone to, if you haven't read Iain's book, buy The Matter with Things. Take a look at Steve's work. We look forward, Steve, to your book emerging in the next several months. And we hope all of you will continue to stay in touch with the Center for Process Studies and the Institute for Cultural Evolution. So good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iain. Thank you, Jared, and everybody.